Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Last call. Does the member from Bordentown West?
Huh? Test. Okay, this is good. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last weekend, as I started going through the budget review and start looking at everything, Mr. Speaker, I actually realized I do owe you a book. You loaned me a book some years back, and come to think of it, I don't think I can actually give it back to you. I'm actually going to keep it. But it was a book I borrowed from your library that spoke about Mandela. Yeah, that's the one I'm missing, and I'm giving it back to you. Actually, come to think of it, I think you may have given it to me, actually. But one of the things that I took out of that book was a poem that Mandela read almost on a very regular basis while he was in prison. And the name of that poem is actually Invictus. And it says, out of the night that covers me, black as a pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody, but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears, looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Mr. Speaker, this is my first throne speech / budget address. And it's very easy sometimes when you're sitting by yourself to put together different words. And I think last weekend was a little bit more challenging in the sense that there was this nice little editorial in the Friday paper by the editor of the Cayman Compass, David Legge. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, my first draft was actually filled with fire and brimstone. And I said to myself, Chris, why should you just really and truly waste time on a man who I think the Premier has already dealt with in this house and has already showed the people the man true colors? I also looked at some of the things that had happened. Because one of the themes that we looked at, we were developing as we were preparing for this was, how can we make a better future by learning from the past? And one of the things that we wanted to make sure that we contribute to this address is at least something constructive and meaningful. As a person who has worked in the financial services industry and also in the tourism industry, I do recognize how important those industries are. And at the same time, Mr. Speaker, as a person who traveled with you when we were doing the bond and selling the Cayman Islands. We recognized just how much research many people did on the Cayman Islands. And as such, I am very careful to guard what it is I say publicly, because people, especially our competitors, use those stories against us. I remember coming back from New York when we had finished the bond, and I remember saying, I need to have a word with the late Desmond Seals, because some of his editorials in the Cayman Net News at the time really made it very difficult for us to sell the Cayman Islands at a time when we needed to sell it. Mr. Speaker, I am glad you actually took the time out to, I guess this morning, raise the issues in terms of what this House can and cannot do, and in particular the PSC. One of the things that I did when I was first appointed to the PSC was I started looking at the PSC hearings of the UK Parliament and also the congressional hearings in the United States. And I want to tell all and sundry that if they think that the PSC here in Cayman is rough, they need to take a look at the PSC in the UK Parliament, because those guys over there take no prisoners. From bankers to senior executives, they call every single person inside there and rate them over the coals. One of the things that I think we need to be mindful of and learning from the past is that we are still a young country. It is very easy for us to compare ourselves with what is happening in countries in North America and Europe, but we need to be mindful that just about every single country in Europe is more than 1,000 years old. The great United States is 241 years old. Our neighbor, Jamaica, is about 55, Trinidad is 55, Bahamas, 44, Barbados, 51, something like that. And we, Mr. Speaker, is still, as they would say, old people say, in the belly. We're still young. So it's important for us to recognize that some things that we did in the past, we need to make sure we learn from them. I remember when I first started putting together the speech, I looked at Dr. Saeed that we brought in from UCCI. Over 100 different applicants. The man had every qualification in 3 different disciplines: computer sciences, marketing, engineering, and over 100 people he slipped past us. The PSC, I can assure you, Mr. Speaker, had I been a member around at that time, a person like that would not have gotten past me. I also look, Mr. Speaker, at our role inside there as legislators, people who make laws. And I think about that lady from the Pines who stole 300,000, took off. Never prosecuted. But yet, Mr. Speaker, you right here in your own country who have nowhere to go to, prosecuted and persecuted. This, ladies and gentlemen of this honorable House, is not how we build a society. And one of the things I want us to make sure of is that, at least for me as a new legislator coming inside here, I want to make sure that what I contribute to this House is enough to attract more people from my generation and the next generation to want to get involved in public service. What I want to make clear is looking at the budget and just kind of getting into that the crux of it. Earlier today, the Honorable Leader of Opposition spoke about the virtues that Gandhi raised concerning the 7 virtues. And when we came across that last week and also spent some time looking at it, and I found a nice article which, I have a copy here for you, Mr. Speaker, don't worry. I really don't need it, but I just want to give you a copy because I actually think it's something worth sharing. Here's my copy, but you can have it. So you can, where's the sergeant? You can have it. This one's actually entitled 7 Deadly Sins by a guy by the name of Sai Kumar Sela. He basically took the virtues of what Gandhi spoke about and expanded on them. And when he says wealth without work, this refers to the practice of getting something for nothing, manipulating markets and assets so you don't have to work or produce added value. just manipulate people and things. Warren Buffett first raised this issue back in 2003 when he spoke about weapons of financial mass destruction. Because capitalism itself was built on doing something, doing it well, and getting paid for it. What we have created in a society now is people not creating wealth, but rather taking someone else's hard work, manipulating around, and getting rich from it. One of the things that jump out to mind with it, Mr. Speaker, is the pensions. In that, whether we want to accept it or not, we have created a culture in this country where government is mandating too many people in the public to give money to private companies. That is wrong. That needs to stop. The only entity that I can tell you or tell this honorable house that will be here in the next 30, 35, 40 years to pay anybody their pension that is due to them is the Cayman Islands government. Had we had a situation or repeat of the 2008 financial crisis 25, 30 years from now, when another bubble busts, the reality of it is a lot of people's pensions would have been wiped out. We already saw the impact on our own pensions during that time, and yet our pension plan was still young. Whether we want to accept it or not, Mr. Speaker, we have to start looking at our own national insurance. We also have to look at a vesting period, because at the end of the day, you just can't have people paying money into private companies and they're getting rich from other people's work. Another simple thing, Mr. Speaker, as simple as you see it, is even the way in which we have people advertise for jobs or work permit renewals. What is to stop the government from having those same ads gazetted and the government making revenues from it? Why should we really and truly sit down here and guarantee a private company just to make tons of money off work permit ads, when in fact that is something that we could be doing ourselves, or in some cases putting it online? But we need to stop this habit of just having private companies in this country make money for nothing. Another thing that they spoke about was pleasure without conscience. And it is that mentality that our people have now taken up. What's in it for me? If I can't get something from it, I'm not going to do it. The late United States President, one of my favorites, JFK, in his inaugural speech back in 1961, had asked Americans to ask a simple question. Ask not what your country can do for you, but rather what you can do for your country. Knowledge without character. It's another issue that we looked at. And one of the things that the author had said, which I find to be...
Honorable member, would you, it's our interruption. Honorable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move the suspension of Standing Order 10-2 in order that the business of the House may continue beyond the hour of interruption.
Thank you. Thank you. The question is that standing orders tend to be suspended in order for us to continue after 4:30. All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. Honorable member for Bordentown West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was talking about the third point, knowledge without character. And he says, as dangerous as a little knowledge is, even more dangerous is much knowledge without strong principled character. Purely intellectual development without commensurate internal character development makes as much sense as putting a young child in front of a high-powered car and then they're putting drugs in their system or something like that. We have a lot of young kids in this country. And while I was actually sitting there, I had a few students who are overseas was messaging me on Facebook, asking me when I wanted to speak because they wanted to hear what was going on in the house. And I was kind of glad to see that because it says that our young kids who are overseas are tuning in. And one of them actually, I think, is a very outstanding young man. And I hope one day, especially since he's watching, and he is really a decent young man, I hope one day that he himself would consider going into public service. He was highly involved in the youth parliament, and he was quite outstanding during that time. But one of the things that we inside here, as the elected leaders of this country, need to make sure is that regardless of whatever the differences are, we still maintain some character, some level of civility, and we deal with each other with respect and everything else. I won't go back into the other three, but the one I wanted to look at was politics without principle. And one of the things that he had said, and I just want to have your indulgence, Mr. Speaker, it's point number 7 on the thing the Sarge gave you. And just the first half, he says, if there's no principle, there's no truth north. Nothing you can depend on. The focus on the personality ethic is the instant creation of an image that sells well in the social and economic marketplace. You see politicians spending millions of dollars to create an image, even though it's superficial, lacking substance in order to get votes and gain office. And when it works, it leads to a political system operating independently of the natural laws that should govern. The key to a healthy society is to get the social will, the value system, aligned with the correct principles. In the best societies and organizations, natural laws and principles governs. That's the Constitution. And even the top people must bow to the principle. No one is above it. As I said before, Mr. Speaker, this House must lead by example as our children are listening. So when I spoke to many people in terms of preparing this, one of the things that really caught me out, because some of these people I seek advice from, counsel from, guidance from, are indigenous Caymanians, new Caymanians, and in some cases even work permit holders. And what that serves to remind me is that the success of this country was built on every single body working together, regardless of wherever they origin. Next year will be 80 years since my grandmother arrived in the Cayman Islands. She first settled in Cayman Brac, where my Uncle George McCarthy was born, and a few years later, she moved to Grand Cayman. My mother was pregnant in her belly. My own father, Mr. Speaker, arrived here in the early 60s, when Cayman had little opportunities. And like many people then, he had to go off to sea. Their genesis in coming to Cayman remind me of two things. One, I remember my grandmother speaking about how warmly she was welcome. I arrived from Jamaica as a young girl with very few skills, but she could sew, and she sure as hell could cook. And I think that's where Champion House came from. My father went to sea, sailing for national bulk. My grandmother's present showed us how welcoming we were to people. And my father going off to sea showed how welcoming people were to us. Because many people who went off to sea came back with good stories of how they were welcome. And Mr. Speaker, I'm happy that the Cayman Islands is in a place today where we can repay the hospitality that was given to our forefathers when they had to leave here to go make a living elsewhere. So for that, I am grateful. But, Mr. Speaker, we also have to recognize, and for people who have just arrived to our shores need to also recognize that even though we are a developing country, and yes, we will make our own mistakes like many countries did, we still have our own value system, our own culture, and our own heritage. And for many people who try to come inside this country and impose their values on us, I would just like to politely remind them, you came here to make a better life for your family. If the environment you were coming from was so great, you would have stayed. Do not try to change my country into where you left from to make a better life for your family. And I don't want to make it appear as if though we're anti anyone coming, but people also need to accept that we are in the Cayman Islands. And at the end of the day, and I can say this, Mr. Speaker, as a person who went to school, both in Kingston and New York, I got my education and I left. I did not get inside the country's business. And I got my education, and I came home to do what I can do in my country. And people also have got to accept that in this country, and where we in this house sit, Caymanians must come first in all that we do. It is not anti anything else. It is just we looking out for what is best for our country. One of the things, Mr. Speaker, that I looked at, there's something called the Human Development Index. That was something that was created in 1990 by the United Nations. And the purpose of the HDI was to shift the focus of development economics from national income accounting to people-centered policies. What they wanted to look at, they looked at three basic metrics at that time. And there was basically a expectancy of the country, the education level, and the GDP per capita. Those are the three basic things that they looked at. And while I will accept that our life expectancy has improved over the years, one of the things that we also need to make sure of is that the quality of life that our people are living as they're living longer is improved. And this is one of the reasons why healthcare is one of the things that is near and dear to me. Right now, Mr. Speaker, there's a young lady at the HSA. She had worked for a company for 24 years. She's the same age as me, is 44 years of age. And her daughter specifically asked me to tell her story. And I will leave her name out because it's irrelevant to the story, but there's a lesson to be learned from it. She worked for a company for 24 years. She got a stroke, and she had to be hospitalized. Which, I mean, I can tell you from personal experience, that was one of the things that my own father suffered from, so I do understand where the family is coming from. At that time, the company had to let her go because she was sick for quite some time. And the family was then forced to get insurance elsewhere. Unfortunately, she couldn't get any insurance, and if she did, she couldn't afford the premiums because nobody's going to insure you when you're actually in the middle of a hospital and you're sick. So she had to turn to Cynical and couldn't afford the premiums from Cynical, and she had to go to NAU, and NAU is now assisting the family. I am pleased that the Premier in his address spoke about expanding the role of Cynical. But, Mr. Speaker, the truth of the fact is we have to do much more with Cynical than expand it. We have to start by asking ourselves a simple question. Do we see healthcare as a benefit, or do we see it as a right? If it is a benefit, as most jobs advertise when they're looking at employees, we can leave things as they are. But if it is a right, then we definitely need to make some changes for it. Under our current system, Mr. Speaker, a young person can leave school at 16, retire at 65. They could have worked 49 years in the private sector and had private sector health insurance during that entire time. At the time when he goes to retire at 65, he has no insurance. He has to turn to Cynical. At the time in his life when he's most needed of health care and most vulnerable. And what we have done in such a system, Mr. Speaker, is that we have allowed the private sector to cherry pick, make all the profit when the person was young and healthy, and then leave the taxpayers of this country to bear the burden when the person mostly needs health care in their later life. That is not a burden that we should be putting down and passing on to our future generations. It is wrong, Mr. Speaker. And I'm hoping that during the next 4 years, the government will do more than just expand Cynical, but rather start looking at implementing universal health care, or at a minimum, allow employees to move from job to job with the health insurance. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, I'm fat. And when you work for small companies and you're fat, they will basically tell those companies, we're not covering him. I had to keep working for large companies, Mr. Speaker, and that's why my resume looks the way it is, because small businesses couldn't get health insurance for me. And that's the reason why I had to go that route. And as soon as you work for the big companies, they didn't care because they look at the monthly premiums, $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 a month, and they're not going to let me being fat come in the way of them making those much premiums. But for the small businesses of this country, Mr. Speaker, that employs the most people, they don't have that luxury. And at a minimum, why I really do feel bad for the family is that the mother's health insurance premium prior to her getting sick was around $300 and something a month. And the family begged the business, say, listen, keep her on, we'll pay the insurance. But the business said no. Naturally, I can tell you from experience, Mr. Speaker, that when you go to renew your premiums the next year and they look at your claims, they then turn around and charge higher premiums for the people who are also within the company. And for many small businesses, they can't afford that. So whether we want to accept it or not, Mr. Speaker, we need to look at the way in which we approach healthcare in this country. I know some people are upset the way in which I attacked the HSA. And I can tell you, it is not a matter of being upset, but it's a matter that in March 2006, Mr. Speaker, I almost died. I went to the HSA and I was completely misdiagnosed. And Mr. Speaker, I can tell you, I was sent home, I was discharged. I was told I was ready to go back to work. And Mr. Speaker, the gentleman in front of me to my right, the Honorable Leader of the Opposition, came to look for me one Monday, drove to town the same day, said to my wife at work, your husband is sick. He needs medical treatment. That same Monday evening, Mr. Speaker, we flew to Miami, and he took me to Cleveland Clinic Tuesday morning. And I remember the doctors, they were saying, oh, well, I couldn't get an appointment till Friday. Mr. Miller turned around at that time and said, nope, he needs to see a doctor today. And in the middle of Cleveland Clinic, he pulls out his phone, he dialed 911. And the ambulance had to leave from one side of the hospital to come to the other side to come get me. And he said, I bet you see a doctor now. Thursday, I had my first procedure. By Friday, I was in surgery. And every morning, Mr. Speaker, and I wake up and I see this 12-inch scar on my back, I am reminded of how close I came to dying. Because I basically had pneumonia that developed into emphysema. And that sometimes I can still feel part of my ribs where they cracked it to get there. So, Mr. Speaker, healthcare is no small business. It's a business that we need to take serious. And thus the reason why I am supportive of always giving Caymanians an opportunity to, prove themselves at the end of the day. If they're not delivering what we expect them to do, then we also need to give someone else an opportunity to do so, but not in a place that is tasked with saving lives. When accountants get it wrong, people go bankrupt. When lawyers get it wrong, they go to jail. But when doctors get it wrong, people die. So it's not something that we can basically take very serious, that we should take serious and play around with it. Mr. Speaker, one of the themes that the opposition is stressing more than anything is education. But when we say education, Mr. Speaker, we're talking about investment in people. And the example that I want to draw to this country is also one of the earliest examples I came across of people investment where we were given two countries. And we were given the characteristics of the countries with no name. And there was a country that had every single natural resources known to man, from minerals to oil, you name it. And it was one of the poorest countries in the world. Then we were given another country that was roughly the size of the state of California. 70% of the country was mountainous, and pretty much they didn't really have any natural resources. And to make matters worse, someone dropped an atomic bomb in that country twice. The first country was Nigeria, the second country was Japan. And what Japan did to really push themselves forward, similar to Singapore and other countries, was invest in their people. We have a good problem in our country, Mr. Speaker, in that we have more jobs than we have people. But also at the same time, we must also recognize that we have a consumption tax system where the bigger the government gets in terms of its spending, the more we'll need for people to consume to pay for it. And if we have Caymanians and just about everyone consuming, then the question is, how can we encourage people to save? Simply put, the day Caymanians start to save, the government is going to go broke. In a nutshell, but saving is supposed to be something good. And that is why it is important for us, Mr. Speaker, to sit down and create that national plan. Because we just can't be building this country as is, having it run in inertia. When I look at page, I don't want to do the wrong one, page 384 of the planning estimates, and you look at the 3 years, you will see that revenues went from 944 million to 985 million, a 41 million increase in 3 years. But during the same period, expenses went from 795 million to 926 million, 130 million. That's a 70 million gap between revenues and expenses in 3 years. And when you look at the fact that the government has, I think, 59 million there as their surplus, it means in the next 3 years at that rate, by 2022, we'd have been back into a deficit position. And this does not include capital. This is just the entire public sector going. And so, Mr. Speaker, it is those kind of efficiencies we need to look at, but we also need to recognize that somewhere within our tax system, and this is why, and I can't tell you that I have the answer, and I'm not going to sit down and try to tell everyone or anyone that this is something that we can fix overnight. We didn't get it overnight, but it's going to take us some time to change it. But the reality of it is, Mr. Speaker, is that we do have a model that literally encourages people to spend. And the average Caymanian can sit down and find himself working 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years. And if I was to go and ask them right now, show me 5% of your total income or 3% of your total income that you have earned over that period of time, and compare that to how much you have saved, I can tell you it's not there. I came across a story on YouTube and where someone was speaking about their life. And it was a survey that was done where they had asked the average American if they had an emergency where they needed to find $400. 47% of the population could not find $400 in an emergency. And as we look at that system and considering that that country has the ability to print money and just run themselves into debt upon debt upon debt, we don't have that luxury. And this is why it's important for us, and especially where the budget is concerned, because we are limited in the tools that we have to move our economy. And the truth of the fact is, Mr. Speaker, this government, previous government, and future government has to face one fact. At some point as you're growing, you're going to need both monetary policy and fiscal policy to move your country. We only have fiscal policy. We have no control over interest rates. We're at the mercy of the banks. And at some point, we have to sit back and we have to say to ourselves, at what point do we take our economy? You look at the United States, they have the Federal Reserve System. And two things that the Federal Reserve is charged with is controlling unemployment and controlling inflation. That is something that the politicians basically gave to the Federal Reserve System, because it is very difficult as politicians when you do need to be popular and you do need votes to lean one way as opposed to doing what is right. There's always a big difference between what is popular versus what is right. And that is where we need to find our balance. So I don't know if the future at some point is that we're going to look at creating institutions where we move certain aspects away from politicians and start more looking at other institutions to manage it. But at some point, we must recognize that the current system that's just running as it is isn't going to work, and it cannot work. And the reality of it is, Mr. Speaker, if we have one economic crisis or one major shock to our system, we can easily find ourselves right back to where we were in 2008. So, Mr. Speaker, one of the other things that I've always said is that as much as we talk about GDP and GDP growth, same as with the Human Development Index, GDP per capita or economic productivity is really what it is that matters. In essence, Mr. Speaker, if you have 5 people living in a house and the household income is 20,000, the average per person is 4,000. If you now have 10 people living in a house and it moves to 30,000, yes, there's growth in household income, but the average is now 3,000 per person. So even though there's a 50% increase in the household income, there's a 25% decrease in the average per person. That 25% decrease is your unemployment and your underemployment. And if you look at the 2016 Annual Economic Report, Mr. Speaker, on page 6 it is, just on this, and if you look at just the key economic indicators, you will see that when we look at the pillars of our economy, namely financial services and tourism, you will see that on the tourism side, air arrivals, and this is just the 2016 numbers that we have, air arrivals is pretty much flat and cruise tourism is slightly down. I expect that cruise tourism should go up this year because of the hurricanes in the Eastern Caribbean. And when you look at financial services, you will see that mutual fund, insurance licenses are flat, mutual funds are down, new company registration is down, and bank and trust licenses are down. But at the same time, the population is going up. So what that tells us, Mr. Speaker, is that the pie is getting smaller, but there are more mouths to feed on the pie. And at some point, somebody's going to start starving. Okay, that's fine. The thing about it is, Mr. Speaker, and like I said, these are the ESO numbers, Mr. Premier, so I can only go by what's there. The thing about it is, Mr. Speaker, is when you look at financial services, many Caymanians don't really pay financial services, as much respect as it should to some extent. And the reason being is that the financial services industry has done a poor job in showing how their industry actually benefit the average Caymanian. The truth of the fact is, Mr. Speaker, is that in order for us to start turning around the decline in the financial services industry, there's going to be some hard decisions to make. Some of you would have remembered back in 1998, the OECD launched something called the Harmful Tax Competition. And one of the things that they were pushing at that time was substantial presence. And that was one of the things that was supposed to put a little bit more pressure on us. But luckily for us, in the 2000 U.S. elections, Paul O'Neill became the U.S. Treasury Secretary, and he pretty much just dismissed that. So under the George W. Bush administration, we got some reprieve in the saying, we don't really think that's important. We're more interested in transparency and tax information. Mr. Speaker, the OECD is back again. And the latest thing now is BEPS, Business Erosion and Profit Sharing. One of the fine prints in that initiative, Mr. Speaker, is again substantial business presence. Now, whether we like it or not, if we are to survive this round, we have to make some changes or decide to just either tell the OECD to get lost or something. But the reality of it is, it will require some changes to the way we do business. It probably will require some changes to our immigration laws, but it will require some changes for us to attract the people that we would need to create that substantial business presence. Again, that is something that the government itself will have to decide in terms of the approach, but I just want to point it out. And the reason I want to point it out, Mr. Speaker, is that I remember you in this house, probably sitting in that chair, back during the first PPM administration, had warned them concerning the financial crisis, and they didn't listen. And I think history speaks for itself in terms of what happened then. and the financial strains that the country had. And I just want to remind the people in my administration also of the same thing in that regard. Mr. Speaker, the other pillar for our economy is tourism. And I'm happy to see the government actually doing something with the airport. I'm glad to see the expansion going through. And I really hope that we have an update of the National Tourism Plan where we can start attracting more longer flights, hopefully get more Europeans and more Asians into our country, because that will definitely improve our stayover numbers. I think at the end of the day, stayover is still the way to go. Equally, Mr. Speaker, cruise tourism. In the last 2 years, it's the first time globally where cruise tourism surpassed air arrivals. And the reality of it is that cruise tourism will be important to our economy. And tourism is still the only industry that creates the most entrepreneurs with the least amount of direct investments. And at the end of the day, we just need to make sure that whatever it is that we're doing, that our people actually get a piece of that pie. Cruise tourism right now, just in the transportation business alone, is my understanding that it creates over 1,000 Caymanian jobs, just in that sector alone with those Caymanian entrepreneurs. So from that standpoint, Mr. Speaker, it has this role to play. Now, when we look at the Florida Cruise, the FCCA report, and we see the share of the pie of the $3.1 billion that's spent on Caribbean tourism, 7 islands, I think, has roughly 67% of the total, based on the 2015 numbers, if my memory serves me right. And the Cayman Islands, I believe, is like number 5 on that list out of the top 7. So we think we are around just about 7% of the market, about 208 million of that 3.1 million. The question I have, Mr. Speaker, with regards to the cruise tourism, and we can probably accept that the pie isn't going to be bigger, but we need to ensure that if we're going to embark on those capital projects, that at the end of the day, we're not just looking to protect what we have, but also to grow what we have. And any strategy that anybody is doing from a business standpoint must achieve one of two things, or both: protect or grow. And we need to make sure that we do the financing right, we do the planning right, and that our people benefit from it. Because at the end of the day, we can't just sit down and just hope, just throw darts on the wall and hope something stick. I'm a stickler for planning, Mr. Speaker, and I guess it's just my nature, based on the discipline in which I operate in. One of the things that I just want to touch back on, Mr. Speaker, is education and the people investment. When we look back again at the HDI statistic, the metric, Human Development Index, the education level and the GDP per capita is key. And whether we want to accept it or not, that investment in our people as a service-based economy is the only way in which it can be done. We do not have oil, we do not have diamonds, minerals, or anything, but what we do have is our people. And it is that investment that we must do. But equally so, Mr. Speaker, we also have to recognize and accept that there are some unscrupulous business people in Cayman that just don't want to hire Caymanians. And they sit down, and the reason that they give is they blame our education system. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, I've been to some of the graduations last July, thereabouts. We have some very bright children in this country. And what we need to accept and also understand is that don't care how bright our kids are, don't care how well they do, they cannot compete against cheap labor. And cheap labor is an issue that this government and this body, Mr. Speaker, will have to find a way to deal with at some point or the other. Whether the government recognizes it or not, the government themselves, by their own procurement policy, actually encourages cheap labor. When you're going to give the bid to the lowest contractor or the lowest bidder, or award a contract to the lowest bidder, in essence, you're basically telling him to go and get the cheapest price. And so I'm pleased to see that the Premier in his address at least is looking now at scoring bids based on the percentage of Caymanians employed. Because ultimately, I think this is one position in which the government must take and play a more leadership role in developing in this country. It is unrealistic to say to our kids, stay in school, work hard, get good grades, go off to college, come back, and then can't get a job. Now, what I find really ironic is the fact that they complain about our domestic education system, that it is not producing enough kids. It's not producing kids that are work ready. But when these same kids, Mr. Speaker, go off overseas into their education system and come back, they still can't get a job. So it leaves you to question if it's really the education system or if it's just outright discrimination on Caymanians. And I think we need to start really putting some sticks in place to deal with some of these companies. I can assure you, Mr. Speaker, we just need to publicly deal with one of them, and the message will be loud and clear. One of the things I want to touch on, Mr. Speaker, coming out from our visits to the different schools, is the segregation within the public school system. We have created a system where expat kids go to private schools and Caymanian kids go to public school. Mr. Speaker, this practice goes against our founding principles. We don't believe in segregation, and when you look at even the school results coming to the Cayman BRAC that doesn't practice segregation, you see a big difference in their results. I've come to the conclusion, Mr. Speaker, that the further the school is away from the Department of Education, the better the results. You know, it's the truth, I'm sorry. So when we sit down and we speak about investing in our people, we need to make sure at the end of the day that we are properly preparing our people for the jobs, but also at the same time, we need to recognize that there are changes within our economy bit by bit. We have already seen some banks now starting to charge people to make a deposit. What people need to also understand is that the bank isn't looking to make $2 from that service. What the bank is actually looking to do is to bring in the North American model where only 26% of their customers actually set foot in a bank. And I can guarantee you, Mr. Speaker, if we allow this trend to just continue bit by bit, as you start going into the banks, you're going to find from 10 tellers, in a matter of time, you're going to be yourself down to 7 tellers, 5 tellers, then down to 2 tellers. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, this is another issue that we need to look at, because one of the things, Mr. Speaker, that we need to be mindful of is that when we speak about employment, there are several different types of employment, and we have been trying to find one magic bullet to deal with the different types of employment. Some will require training, some will require upskills, and some will just require a lot more work than others. You know, many Caymanians can remember when our men came back from sea and the banking industry was starting. Many just couldn't transition from being on a ship to being in a bank, but they took on other industries. And we got to recognize, Mr. Speaker, is that we need to ensure and plan properly for what we think the Cayman will look like in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. The budget itself is a planning tool. But the one question I keep asking myself is, what exactly is it planning to achieve? I mean, what I'm looking for more than anything, Mr. Speaker, is that increased quality of life for our people. And I think this is where the government and members of this House will have to go through and have that conversation with the Caymanian people to say, well, if we do this, this is what we will achieve. One of the things for me that is near and dear is looking at ways to put money back into people's pocket. Right now, I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, the insurance industry, not to beat on them, is making far too much money on 40,000 working people. It is just too much. And I am hoping that somewhere along the line that my good friend, the Minister of Health, will look at bringing back free health care for kids and free health care for seniors. That initially, just that one gesture, Mr. Speaker, will have a lot of single mothers and a lot of Caymanian families saving on their monthly premium instantly. Because what some insurance companies are charging just to insure kids, it's really not worth it, especially looking at healthy people. One of the things that we also have to accept, Mr. Speaker, is that we do have a lot of healthy people in Cayman in terms of where the insurance is concerned. For the simple fact that right now in the private sector, which is roughly around 60% non-Caymanian, we require a medical from all the permit holders that come here to work. So we get to see exactly up front that's all right. Thanks for that, Mr. Mike Tiger. We do have a lot of healthy people coming here because we're not taking anybody that's coming in with any major cancers or HIV or anything like that, based on some of the metrics that we're looking at. So it is really unfair to the government and the people of the Cayman Islands to have insurance companies cherry picking and then leaving cynical and the taxpayers to take the people that they don't want. That is wrong. Straight up. One of the things, Mr. Speaker, and I don't want to get too much into philosophy, but one of the things that most of the great philosophers will tell you that people need 4 basic things in order to be happy. They need the ability to grow, the freedom to think, to make mistakes. They need to feel part of a bigger purpose, and they also need to feel connected. The one ministry over there, Mr. Speaker, that has the best ability to achieve most of those things is the Ministry of Education and Sports. The ability to grow where people can learn and see exactly what it is that they can get to or they can better themselves. I mean, that's what people want. No one wants to be in a job for 10, 15, 20 years doing exactly the same thing. They want to be able to grow. They also want the freedom to think, make their mistakes, being part of a bigger purpose, and feeling connected. That's what education does. And, Mr. Speaker, whether we want to accept it or not, this is one of the founding principles that we had, was invested in our people. I'm from the generation where, while scholarships may not have been as plenty as they are today, I was fortunate enough to have gotten an education that was paid for by the people of this country. I remember even many times in university, Mr. Speaker, you and I having conversations where we'll call you and we'll, those are them good old days, which probably won't come back anytime soon. But I'm just.
You mean the days that you were listening to me?
Huh? Mr. Speaker? Or the day I woke up? But one of the things, in recognizing that, Mr. Speaker, there's one story I want to tell, especially for our young kids that are probably listening, is that I made it through high school just by having a really good memory. I never had to study. I could memorize stuff, show up the night before exams, do well. When I went to college, that didn't happen. I realized the ability to just do that went through the door. And Mr. Speaker, I guess I can say it now. My first year at university, my GPA was 1.69. Now, that doesn't mean I was dunce. It just basically means I was partying too much in New York, having a good time, and thought I could have showed up the night before exam, cram, and do well. That didn't happen. And I decided, you know what? I didn't want to be an accountant anyway. To hell with it. I wanted to fly planes. So I went to my father and I said to him, Dad, I want to go pilot school. He said, Chris, I'm not giving you any money to go learn how to fall out of the sky. Because when the engine cut off, those wings can't flap. But nonetheless, I decided to go do what I could do anyway. And during the time of building up my hours, Mr. Speaker, I ended up working at Island Air. And it just so happened that I had to call the Ministry of Aviation to make an appointment for someone at Island Air. And when I left my name for them to call me back, I forgot that the Ministry of Aviation at that time was also the Ministry of Education. And I remember the lady saying, Christopher Saunders, wait a minute. Aren't you on a government scholarship? Shouldn't you be in school? What are you doing at Highland Air? Well, Mr. Speaker, all hell broke loose. Well, the government gave me a choice back then. Go back to school and finish or pay them back their money. Now, not many people probably would have had that opportunity, but I'm grateful for the government of the day at that time that gave me that opportunity. And I am really grateful. Plus, I couldn't afford to pay back that money with what I was making back then. When I went back to university, as opposed to the first time where I sat at the back of the class, I sat at the front. And when I started in 91, I should have finished in 95. So when I'm back in 95, most of the kids that I started with either graduated or dropped out. And my GPA went completely in the opposite direction. So much so that the dean of the university at the time wanted to meet me to see how I went from about 1.69 to about 3.9, thereabouts. And what he missed was the years I was out in between. And it was during that time out that I learned the value of an education. That plus the fact that when I went back to school and these young kids start calling me elder, I realized I really didn't belong there, but I just had to do what I had to do and get out. The reason why I say that, Mr. Speaker, is that someone would have taken my first year performance and used that to judge me. And we have a tendency, Mr. Speaker, of labeling our kids far too soon and too early. Because if I did not get that second opportunity back from the government at the time, I probably wouldn't be standing here today. And this is why it is important for us from an education standpoint to stop sitting down and saying things like, not everybody is academically inclined. My first son wanted to make movies. There's nothing academic much about that. My daughter wants to be a judge, and my last son wants to be commissioner of police. But somebody's going to get up and tell him that something is wrong with him not wanting to be a doctor, lawyer, accountant. It is that class system slowly, Mr. Speaker, that we're developing into this country. And we are basically taking our young kids out of areas that make money. One of the things I want to thank Johan Maxim for during his presidency at the Chamber of Commerce is that they went back and they looked at the Chamber salary survey. They did one in 2016, and prior to that, the previous time they did one was 2006. And Mr. Speaker, when I look at the jobs in 2006 and 2016, 10 years apart, I saw in some cases where the salary moved to, some cases where the salaries remained flat, and in some cases where the salary decreased over 10 years. It shows the importance of what we need to plan with. And while the last version I got was in a format that was very difficult to cut and paste, one of the things I want to do over the Christmas term is to put all of that in an Excel sheet and publish it so people can at least have an idea that there are many jobs outside of the norm that actually pay good money and that we should be looking to encourage our kids to do. This whole thing about not everybody is academically inclined is part of what is really destroying our education system. Because we have turned around and make it look as if though someone who wants to do something else is doing that because they're dunce or they don't have good grades. and that needs to stop. When you look at the industries, when you had people like George Seymour, Mr. Speaker, that came back, you look at entrepreneurs, you look at Biggie Rankin, you look at all of those guys, and what they were able to achieve with what they had. At the end of the day, we have lost that. When I look in my generation, the amount of new entrepreneurs that we have created is very limited. One of them is actually my good friend, John, who took a risk in his business and just went out there and do it. And it is getting back to creating an economy that create those entrepreneurs where Caymanians can feel in charge of their own destiny, feel in charge of their own industry is where we need to get to. Mr. Speaker, one of the things that kind of jumped out at me is our seniors. And we have reached a point in our society where we're not giving our seniors, we're not doing right by them. And that is something that we need to stop. Now, I am happy that the government is increasing the grant by $100 beginning next year and $100 the year after. But one of the things, Mr. Speaker, is that we need to focus not just on what people are making, but also what we're allowing people to keep. There are too many greedy people out there that right now, as we are inside this house, is thinking of ways to take money, people's hard-earned money, out of their pockets from doing basically nothing. And I know while the Premier may have threatened or advised them that the government would not be afraid to put in consumer protection that may include price control to some effect, at some point, Mr. Speaker, we need to recognize that if some businesses don't want to learn, then we need to find ways to deal with it. One of the things, Mr. Speaker, that really jumps out at me is the telecoms, in the sense that it is beyond me, having worked at both major telephone companies, why customers who are prepaying, who's paying for something up front, is being charged what they're being charged on a prepaid call in terms of minutes and everything else. And when you look at the capital investment that these businesses have made, they have made millions of dollars many times over, and with very little investment. And now we're seeing it now, Mr. Speaker, where the job losses, don't talk about the roaming yet, where the job losses have already started in some companies. When you look at roaming, Mr. Speaker, in terms of what they're charging people, I can tell you from experience that the roaming cost of most telephone companies is fixed on a flat per month. That's the agreement that they have with many carriers. And the reason being is that what it costs to even go through the billing system to send another company the information to charge you, it's actually cheaper to just say, you know what, give me your money. And we don't have all of these other administrative costs. So when you see people coming back and being charged what they're being charged, especially for data roaming and everything else, Mr. Speaker, these are the kind of things that we need to make sure that we have legislation, teeth in the legislation to deal with. But companies just can't be going out and just charging people. How much they charge you? 19,000? I rest my case there, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the things that I'm a little bit disappointed that the government didn't touch on was the whole issue of mortgage. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to tell anybody that there is a magic bullet for it, because that'd be a little bit misleading. What I proposed in the last sitting was at least changes in the registered land law to make it more difficult for at least someone to start proceedings or give people a little bit more time. What I wanted to propose, Mr. Speaker, is that depend on the amount of equity a person has in a property, they'll have more time than a person with 50, 60, 70% equity should have more time than a person with just 5% or no equity in their property. But that is one of the things that we need to do. And we have been using a system where we're using a registered land law. And the problem with using such a system, Mr. Speaker, is that if we change that law, then we also will affect private individuals' ability to even lend money to each other. So it's not really a one-size-fits-all. But what we need to at least look at, Mr. Speaker, and I'm hoping that the government would consider, start looking at a mortgage law. United Kingdom have one, I think, back from 1974 when they implemented the last one that they probably had. And I'm sure there may have been changes since. But at least at a minimum, we start looking at having a mortgage law. We can't be sitting here going into 2018, Mr. Speaker, and not properly have a law in place to protect the largest investment that Caymanians would make in their life. You know? One of the things, Mr. Speaker, that jumped out at me on the government proposed list of legislative changes was the national CCTV. I think security is a big issue, but at the same time, I would encourage the government to find out what happened to the previous $5 million that we spent on the previous CCTV project and what value for money, if any, did the Caymanian people get for that. Because, Mr. Speaker, that in itself is something that we need to get to the bottom of. You know, and speaking of the CCTV, and again, Mr. Speaker, not to bring up old wounds, but one issue that still jumps out at me, Mr. Speaker, is the whole CarePay fiasco. I am still uncomfortable with the outcome of what happened in the CarePay, in the sense that only one person is sitting in Northward and nobody has got fired for an $11 million fraud that was perpetrated on the HSA, Cynical, and the Caymanian people. I know the Deputy Governor, Mr. Speaker, is trying his best to get more accountability within the civil service. But one of the things that they need to understand is that the public also needs a certain amount of confidence. And you cannot have people making major mistakes and either just sitting in government or just maintaining employment when anywhere else people will just think that something is wrong. I mean, the public confidence is what it is that we inside this house use in order to do our job, and the government must lead by example in that regard. So I am hoping, and I know I have parliamentary questions on the CarePay, so I really won't go too much into that. One of the things, Mr. Speaker, that I wanted us to take the time out to kind of explain to the Caymanian people roughly how is it our consumption-driven economy works. Earlier I spoke about the financial services industry, and I spoke about tourism, and what we need to understand is that as a, one second. What we need to understand is that as a service-based economy, money comes into our economy externally, mostly via tourism and via financial services. And then it moves through the economy, through consumption, development, pretty much via the multiplier effect. It is therefore important for us, Mr. Speaker, in that we be honest with the Caymanian people and say to them, you know, we need to ensure that we maintain an economy that continues to attract tourism and also financial services. But at the same time, we also need to accept that we need to find a way for Caymanians to benefit from these industries. And that is really where the issue is, where a lot of people feel as if though they're not benefiting. And when we see other people come here and doing quite well, and our people not doing quite as well, those are the kind of things that start social upheaval in a country. Or as the old British colonialists would say, the natives will come in restless. One of the things I spoke to you about, Mr. Speaker, prior to the SPS, is trying to call members of the House together to look at the creation of a national strategic plan. This year makes 20 years since we embarked on Vision 2008. That pretty much had no political support, despite being one of the big issues of the 2000 political campaign, where everyone pledged to implement Vision 2008. That was something that was pushed by the UK government at the time as part of the old white paper initiative to reset their overseas relationship with overseas territories. But I think it is high time now, Mr. Speaker, that we in this House, led by yourself and the government, at least start going out district to district if needs be, speaking to people and developing the national strategic plan. The reality of it is, Mr. Speaker, is that while these planning estimates and budget documents speak about numbers, it still does not look at the overall quality of life for our people. And that's one of the things that we really need to focus on is what can we do to improve the quality of life for our people. And that, more than anything, Mr. Speaker, is what I think everyone in this House was elected to do, make people's lives better. One of the issues, Mr. Speaker, whether we want to, and this, the last school I went and visit, or the opposition went and visit, Mr. Speaker, was John Gray. And a student at John Gray had asked a question that gave me pause. And the reason the question gave me pause, Mr. Speaker, is that when you go out and you're campaigning, you're going house to house, you sell people the idea that there's hope and you're going to make their life better. And when that young lady had asked the question in terms of she securing a job when she left school, I had to literally be honest with her in that it's not going to be as easy as it was for people from my generation. Because I came back from a time where literally people were begging you to come work for them. And that's a luxury that we had. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, for those from my generation who were able to do quite well with the little that we had, I don't think that those coming out of school will have the same thing that we have. Every single one of us here in this House inherited a better Cayman than we have today. And what we need to recognize is that we're not going to be remembered by what we inherited. We're going to be remembered by what we left behind. And I am asking the members of this House, regardless of what, put the differences aside. We have about 3 years before we get back into the election or the campaigning season, that we can work together to make people's lives better. No. And they get finished? Oh, good God. No, man. The thing about it is, Mr. Speaker, why I raise that issue up is that that's all right. No. The reason why I want to bring that up, Mr. Speaker, is that for the little time that I've been here, I've seen how politics have become. And I know you guys are going to say, yeah, you're rookie, you're new, and it's part of that and the whole 9 yards. But I didn't go through this, Mr. Speaker, like everyone else inside here, because whether we want to accept it or not, and whether the public see it or not, campaigning and getting an election isn't easy. You're going out, you're begging for votes, your family suffer. It takes a lot out of you personally, professionally, financially. It takes a lot. And some people are even surprised to see that even I guess like the Premier, is still an introvert at heart and still shy or nervous when we, have to do public speaking or public engagements or whatever. But the thing about it is, Mr. Speaker, is that every single one of us inside this House have been given a unique opportunity to, thanks. Every one of us have been given a unique opportunity to make other people's life better. The cost of living in this country, Mr. Speaker, is really, really challenging for many people. when I look at the fact that we had more Caymanians who lost their homes at a time where we had some of the lowest interest rates ever, says to me or makes me wonder what's going to happen when interest rates start to go back up. We saw some of the highest light bills, even though they may have been lower compared to prior years, when we had the lowest global prices of fuel. Yet, fuel is not expected to start going back up to at least maybe $57, $58 a barrel from as low as 40 at one point, or even bit lower than that. And the truth of the fact is, Mr. Speaker, at a time when our people should have been benefiting from a lot of the global issues out there, it didn't happen. And whether we want it or not, now as prices are going up, we see it starting already. Banks are raising interest rates as quickly as they're out there. And whether we want to accept it, Mr. Speaker, and I know we as earlier spoke about monetary policy. The truth of the fact is, for what banks are charging on interest rates compared to what it is that they're paying for the money that they get, this is something that we seriously need to look at regulating or look at even passing some legislation to give people a little bit more protection from some of the margins that banks are charging. I can tell you as a former banker, Mr. Speaker, they get paid a lot of money to do very little. And to some extent, I understand where that is. One of the things, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad that the minister that we have, agriculture, is Ms. Julie, in that, Honorable Minister, I apologize, for agriculture, in that I think that is one industry that we can do a lot more with. Yeah. Sorry, no, I apologize for that. But to the Honorable Minister is that, because I know agriculture is one of the things that is near and dear to her. And I strongly believe that I think it's more from a term endearment standpoint, so I apologize. But one of the things is, Mr. Speaker, is that when I look at the the land, some of the land that we have in some of the areas that we have, Mr. Speaker, I believe that there's a lot more that we can do on the agricultural front. One of the projects that I'm looking to launch in my district is to look at some of the vacant lands that we have and see if we can start planting some goods on it, where half can be sold and half can go to some of the senior citizens within the community. Because one of the things, Mr. Speaker, is that when we look at the number of farmers that we have, I don't see enough young people coming up to replace the farmers that we have. Now, I know the Premier plans after this term to retire and go to his farm in East End, so I know we'll have one more farmer there, but at the end of the day, it is one of the things that we need to encourage more people to get involved in. Agriculture itself is still one of the largest industries in the world. But for whatever reason, it is one that we have not allowed ourselves and our people to get involved with. And I would love to see both the government and the opposition working together in terms of promoting agriculture. And, Mr. Speaker, I wouldn't think it would be weird to even say to the government, look at even purchasing land in places such as even Costa Rica or elsewhere, to see if there's also places where we can also farm, because at the end of the day, we need to take our food security serious, and we are still importing a lot of things, and I still firmly believe, despite there may not be any proof to it, that a lot of the sickness we have and a lot of the cancers we have comes from some of those foods that we import. Because, Mr. Speaker, we don't know what kind of pesticides and what kind of chemicals some of those things are using when they get here. But when you look at the amount of stage 4 cancers and how quick some people are diagnosed with cancer and how advanced it becomes for a small island I think that is something quite alarming and that we need to look at. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to touch on an uncomfortable subject that many people may not like, and that's the subject of immigration. We need to recognize that the open immigration policy that we have cannot continue. Period. When you look at what is happening in the United Kingdom with Brexit, and even with the election of Donald Trump, and even some of the other far parties in Europe coming to getting elected into power, we realize that this is still a sore issue for many people. Most people, Mr. Speaker, they said that will born, live, work, and die within 30 miles of where they're born. And while a lot of people have come to accept foreign films, foreign cars, foreign food, and foreign music, it is still one of the things that people still have their own issues to deal with in a unique way. What we need to recognize, Mr. Speaker, is that we have an immigrant. Sorry. Yeah, man, drink water. What we need to recognize, Mr. Speaker, is that we have an immigration system that imports poverty. And the impact to the average Caymanian family is that they're the ones that are paying or playing the bulk of the impact of this, and it's mostly the Caymanian middle class. When we consider, Mr. Speaker, that we have a consumption-driven economy, it means that we need people to consume in order to afford to live here. What we cannot have, Mr. Speaker, is bringing people here that cannot afford to live here. Because when you look at the roads being built as a result of population increases and everything else, it is the average Caymanian middle class that is taking on the burden, and also to some extent the business people of this country. If we're going to maintain a consumption system, at a minimum, we'll need people that can afford to consume. In some cases, whether we want to accept it or not, we are also importing prostitution within the country, Mr. Speaker. In that we have young ladies working in some establishments that we know cannot afford to live here, but can only live or survive with another man, quote unquote, minding them. And most of the time, that man is another married man that has his own commitments. Mr. Speaker, as simple as you want to see it, it is these kind of social issues that bit by bit slowly erodes a society. And like I said, it's an uncomfortable subject, but it's nonetheless a subject that needs to be discussed. And I believe that this is the place to discuss it. We also need to accept, Mr. Speaker, in that this is still a Christian society. There are certain values that we are founded on. And I'm not going to sit back and tell anybody that, I'm one of those devout Christian and wear my religion on my sleeves or whatever. But I can tell you what, I see the product, which is many of the people that are sitting inside this house that came out from a time where our Christian values played a more active role in our society. And you have got to accept, Mr. Speaker, that during those times, Cayman was a better place to live and work. And when we speak about returning to our founding principles, we need to accept that the church does have a role to play within our society. You were campaigning against me and keeping me out. That's all right. But, sorry. But the thing about it is, I know it's thing there, but the thing about it is, whether we want to accept it or not, and I'm going to tell you guys of this honorable house, members of this honorable house, I'll tell you, I thought long and hard in terms of we're going to take this approach. And I just decided that I'll just speak my mind, say what I gotta say, and at the end of the day, the voters decide. But we gotta call a spade, because one of the things that we have done is we have become too politically correct, and no one wants to speak the truth. And I'm going to tell you right now, I just gotta say about my pieces, and everybody know how it is that I roll. So, but the thing about it is going back to the society, Mr. Speaker, and give credit where credit is due. Your nation building, while it wasn't managed the right way, Mr. Speaker, was still something that we as a young country still needed to look at and start looking at what incentives or what it is that we could have done to basically move us further. Because as I said before, we're still a young country. We're still developing. We will make mistakes. But at the end of the day, we still need to look at initiatives that encourages nation building. I'm glad to see the government is bringing back the award system, and I just hope the merit system where we can recognize people's contribution to the islands, and hope at the end of the day that it is something that does not become political, but it's something that every single one of us there can embrace. Because at the end of the day, we still need to recognize people for contributions that they have made to our country, whether we like them or not. But at the end of the day, right is still right, regardless of what. I was speaking about our Christian heritage, and the thing about it is, Mr. Speaker, at the age of 44, I can tell you that, still young and good looking, yeah. I can tell you that many things that my parents and grandparents had taught me that I brushed off as a little person, it is as a younger person, it is as I got older, I appreciated certain things. I guess you can say it comes with age or whatever. But this is why I say for us that it is important that we in this house, and I go back to the time when we had some really strong men and women in our country that helped to build it, that we need to find a way to go back there. I'm fortunate that I'm from the district of Bordentown West, where Cayman First National Era came from, and that's something I carried a badge of honor, in the sense that I feel as if though the people of Bordentown West expect a certain type of politician, the no-nonsense type or whatever, which was fine by me. But we need to recognize that our social structure must remain. And the government, via its own fiscal policy, needs to ensure that they use policies that maintain or enhance or protect our social structure. Because, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you, once the social structure breaks down, everything else is going to follow suit. And this is why it is important. So one of the things I'm open for in the Finance Committee is to start looking at the programs, especially after-school programs, Mr. Speaker. That time between 3 and 5, when schools are finished and the parents are still in work, that those 2 hours are very serious within a child's life. And we need to make sure that, at a minimum, we inside this house have set aside the necessary resources to manage that time period. Equally so, Mr. Speaker, early childhood education. The young people told us, the older folks told us the formula long ago. Bend the tree from it young. The first 7 years of a child's life is one of the most important. And this is why we need to make sure within the education system that we beef up the spending there, we put the resources we need there. Because I can tell you, for what is costing us for kids in Bonaventure and what is costing us in Northward, it is cheaper to put the money in the education system from now to make sure we don't have the problems that we have. It is cheaper. So from that standpoint, Mr. Speaker, I am hoping that as we get into Finance Committee and we start going through the numbers, that we can at least agree in some cases, because one of the things that is not easy, and I'm not going to tell anybody that the government have an easy job, because when I do look at the expenses that's made up of the government expenses, and you look at what you call a fixed cost, the government is probably running around 70-75% of the costs already being fixed. So there's very little room to really move around to something different without increasing taxes. So I'm not going to say that the government has an easy job to do. But for the little room that we have, at a minimum, we need to find some level of priority. The purpose of an economy, Mr. Speaker, is to make the lives of people better. And this budget and this budget process, we need to ensure that it does that. Having been a former civil servant and know the kind of work that goes into the budget, I know that at the end of the day, the ministers are more the mouthpieces of the countless thousands of hours that the civil servants put into putting this together. I can tell anybody it's no easy feat. And that is why I am very guarded in the words that I choose, because at the end of the day, the last thing you want to do is seen as someone who just come behind and criticize anybody's work. Nobody likes that. And I can't sit here and talk about nation building or sit here and talk about promoting Caymanians and then at the same time look at the collective efforts of many civil servants and then tear it down. This is not how a house or any process is supposed to work. And as much as it's very easy and tempting for me to have gone through as an accountant and look for numbers and look for discrepancies and everything else, what I'm open for is that in some cases, and I can tell you on some pages, I can see where the numbers are just mistakes. I can see that some of the inputs are just mistakes. But then you look pedantic just picking that out to say in thousands of pages you find some mistake. I mean, that is not what we're about. What we're supposed to be about in this house is policy. What we're supposed to be about is the direction of this country. And then this is the resources, the numbers are the resources or the dollars that we're putting to move the country forward. And so recognizing that, I have a lot of friends on the other side of the aisle also. Because at the end of the day, we do get together sometime. And it's important for the public to know that even though we have an adversarial approach to politics in this country, as required by the Westminster system, that many people on this side of the aisle are friends, where they get together, and sometimes while the cameras may be out here and the cameras isn't in the common room, is that people don't see the camaraderie of what goes on in the kitchen when we're breaking bread. People come out there and actually think that these people don't like each other. So I think it's important for us at a minimum to send the right message as leaders of this country that regardless of the differences that we may have, and it should be political and not personal, is that we're still Caymanians and we still want what is best for our country. So, Mr. Speaker, when I was saying about immigration being a sensitive subject, we also need to recognize that we just can't continue as is. Right now, as it stands, one of the things when we were going to the school visits, one of the things that I was counting as I was going to each class was how many kids in grade 5, how many kids in grade 6. Because what I want to keep a mental track of is how many people are leaving the high school. Do we have more coming in versus more going out, that kind of stuff, and see where the numbers would be. But what's missing from that number, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that we have close to 5,000 people in this country with permanent residency. And the minute that they become Caymanian and their kids are then entitled to public schooling, the question is, have we now planned enough classrooms and enough for the potential new Caymanians that we have, considering that we have close to 5,000, if not more, permanent residences? Right now, most of those kids are actually in private schools. But at some point, when the parents become Caymanian and the kids by extension become Caymanians, they are then entitled to public schooling. So we need to make sure that when we're sitting down and we're planning long-term for education, we take those things into consideration. This is the reason why, for us on this side of the aisle, education, or as you refer to it as investment in people, is still the best way forward for this country. Now, at the same time, when you're investing in people, there have to be something that people should be able to do with that investment. So thus we need to make sure that our people have the jobs when we have done invested the money inside them. As I said before, I was lucky enough when I came back that we had jobs to choose from. We had that luxury, but that was in the late 90s. That's 20 years ago. Those days are gone. Kids are coming out of school now with master's degrees and can't find a job. Almost unheard of in Cayman. And one of the things, Mr. Speaker, that we have done to the people of this country is we have sold them this notion that businesses must train and develop Caymanian. Mr. Speaker, that was always our responsibility as Caymanians. That was something that we should never have resourced out. And what has come out from that notion is that if a person went to work for a small business that could not afford to train that person or develop that person, and that person stayed in a job for 20, 25, 30 years, that person now find themselves in a world where they have not upskilled themselves for the jobs that are available today. And we have created a sector of people within our country that are really out of job for years. It has passed the points of weeks and months. You have people in this country that have not worked for years. But when you sit down and you have that conversation with them, you find out that many of them have not even gone back to class or gone back into a classroom. And this is the kind of programs that we need to make sure. And I saw, I think, inside the education vote where they have classes for adult literacy at UCCI. But I think it's important for us inside this house to find out what those classes are and promote them even more. Because at the end of the day, whether a person sets foot in that classroom or not, the salaries at UCCI is going to be paid. We have already incurred the costs. So there's no use to have people sitting outside when they can go to UCCI or elsewhere, because we're already paying the light, we're already paying for the salaries, and at least get the kids, get the adults upskilled. But that is one of the things that we need to start looking at seriously, is adult literacy in this country. Now, some companies, if you're fortunate enough to work for a bigger company that had a good training program in place and could invest in their employees and send them off to training, then that's fine. But for the companies that didn't do it or couldn't afford to do it, we need to ensure that we have the resources in place to ensure that our people have not been left behind. Because we have created a group of people in this country, a lot of them coming out of school from the 1980s, 1990s, early 90s, and thereabouts, that are, I would almost say, technology literate when it comes on to moving into the workplace today. And what we also need to accept is that we are proud people. And a lot of them, I can tell you from speaking to them, you can see their frustration in that they're almost embarrassed, but they're frustrated. And we need to find a way to get them back into the classroom and prepare them. Because, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you they're bright. When you sit down, you talk to them, they're bright. But they still need the tools. And this is why for us on this side, that investment in people is really a big thing that we need to get to. We have, as I said before, Mr. Speaker, a good problem. We have more jobs than we have Caymanians. But we can't sit down and just keep bringing in people that have the skills that our people don't have and think that that is acceptable. And as such, we need to look at not just when we're doing procurement to give breaks to companies that have a higher percentage of Caymanians, but when we're charging fees, Mr. Speaker, we need to look at companies that do better for Caymanians than others. When I was in the banking business, Mr. Speaker, and you may have recalled this, when I was pushing to lower the bank license fees, and I was calling near the bank for Cayman National Bank by $250,000. And at the same time, I was encouraging them to charge my bank $250,000 more. Because my bank at that time had 70% Caymanian, CNB had 98% Caymanian. Why should I be paying the same license fee of $1 million a year at CNB when CNB is clearly hired more Caymanians than my bank? That $500,000 gap, Mr. Speaker, would have allowed me to go to my board of directors and say, look at that, they're paying $500,000 less than us. Do you know how much loans you'll have to write to get back $500,000 at interest rates at that time? But that's the kind of encouragement that we need to be giving businesses. So when businesses are out there doing well for Caymanians, we need to sit down and say, you know what, if this is what they're paying for a permit, or this is what they're paying for an annual fee, give them a break. Encourage them. That is one way I can assure you, you see the percentage of Caymanians start going up. You know, Mr. Speaker, Yesterday I met with a very bright person. Englishman, very bright. I have a lot of time for him. And one of the things I wanted to get from him was what it was that we did well in our financial services industry. That we got a lot of business then, and we're not seeing as much as we should know. And his answer actually floored me. He said, Chris, we are brighter than them in New York and elsewhere. We are just brighter than them. I said, just brighter? He said, yeah, we were brighter than them. When the phone rang and you had 15 seconds to make the case for business to come to the Cayman Islands, we made a better case than many of our competitors. We were just brighter than them. And when I look back at many conversations that I've had with people within our community, we have so much talent in our country, especially amongst our seniors. But for whatever reason, we have left them behind, we have left them alone, and we have just discarded them to just go look for them every now and then or whatever. We need to find ways, Mr. Speaker, of taking some of our seniors out, putting some of them back on the right government boards, and in some cases, putting some of them back in the classroom. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, politics is my second to last career. My last career, hopefully God's willing, is teaching. I hope that maybe after 12 years of doing this, and I still have some energy left, I can go back into the primary school and teach and hopefully be able to make an impact for young people in terms of bending that tree from its young. But that's not something that we can do alone. But we also have to recognize that parents themselves also have a role in raising the children. Mr. Speaker, a lot of parents don't have the time as they should to spend with their kids. Some are working 2 jobs, some are working no jobs, and some of them are highly stressed. When you look at the last statistics that came out of the hospital and you see what people are going to the hospital for, you realize that a lot of people are going there for lifestyle issues, stress. Hypertension was still number 1. A lot of people are worried, and that's the reason why it's important for us inside here during this process, regardless of whatever disagreements we have, to at least be able to say to the Caymanian people, we're going to work hard to make sure that your tomorrow is better than it is today. But at the same time, Mr. Speaker, we also need to recognize that we can't talk it into being. It will require some actions. It will require some legislative changes, and it will also require some policy changes. Some of these policy changes are difficult. Some of them may be unpopular, but I think at some point, one government will at least have to bite the bullet and say, you know what, this is what it is that we have to do. We have stopped engaging the Caymanian people. And sometimes maybe we think that because of what we're doing is too complicated, that they won't understand it. We still need to also remember that the public business can't be done in private. And at the end of the day, we're working for them, not the other way around. People created government for 3 basic reasons: to protect their life, to protect their liberty, and to protect their property. And the Cayman Islands, like many other countries around the world, is now in a precarious position where the economic power of a few is now eroding the political power of the many. And we need to make sure inside this house at some point, and like I said, it may be a little bit uncomfortable to some people to accept, we're going to be looking, we have to bring in campaign finance reform, and we have to look at the way how people are elected. There are special interests in this country that has far too much influence than they should. And I know, like I said, it's a sore spot, but at some point, it is one of the things that we have to deal with. Mr. Speaker, in banking, there's something called concentration risk. In a nutshell, if you have $1 billion on a balance sheet and someone comes in and asks to borrow $1 million, and I would ask if you would lend them, you got $1 billion in deposit and someone wants to borrow $500,000, you probably say, you know what, we can afford to lend them that. But then, if that $1 billion is held by one person, you'll sit back and you'll say, but if this person come for their money and I went lend 500,000 of it, I'm out of luck.
Honorable member, are you coming to a close on your speech, or you have much you want to go? If we take the break now, you'll have 15 minutes more. We'll take the evening break at this point. You have 15 minutes left.
15 minutes left?
15 minutes at this point. The House will suspend until 7:15. Usually we take at least an hour and an evening break. 7 o'clock. The House is suspended until 7 o'clock. I'm wondering if I'm going to ever get agreement on these things. Can I say so?